my book there? No, I don't. No,
Good evening, everybody.
that would be extraordinary. So.
Good evening. Welcome to the Frontline Club. Thank you for coming this evening, despite the glorious weather outside. In a moment, I'll hand you over to Paul French, who will be chairing tonight's discussion. Before I do so, if I can just ask you to switch your phones to silent, and when it comes to questions, if you can wait for the microphone, because this evening is broadcast live on our YouTube channel. So over to Paul.
Thank you, Millicent. I think this is working. Tiananmen Revisited, 25 years later. It is 25 years, it seems to me. And still something that we need to talk about, and still something that people are writing about regularly. Tonight, it's very excellent to have Louisa Lim, who is originally of this parish, but as a hack, originally for the BBC and then for NPR, in China for over a decade, reporting from Shanghai and Beijing, and all over as well, but based in those two cities. And now just become a professor of journalism at the University of Michigan, which is an amazing ascendancy, I think, to do that. And that'll be fun. So she's now an academic and has just published this incredible book, which has been getting rave reviews on both sides of the Atlantic and everywhere else, although maybe not perhaps in China, I don't know. The People's Republic of Amnesia, Tiananmen Revisited, copies on sale. James Miles, we're very lucky to have James as well. I think for as long as I've known James, he seemed to be one of those people who, as far as I know, never really sort of left China. He always, he obviously must have come back here at some points, but he always seemed to be off reporting somewhere, and is one of those people who is either very, very lucky or very, very unlucky, depending on how you live your life. He, as a young reporter, ended up in Beijing at Tiananmen 25 years ago last month. But since then, he's managed to sort of go wandering off for a holiday in Tibet, just when there was an uprising, and various other places. People have suggested that the two are linked, that wherever he turns up, there is likely to be riots. So maybe if there are summer riots in London this year, we'll know that it is official that James Miles is back in town, where he has, of course, long been the Economist China correspondent and is now editing the dedicated China pages for The Economist magazine from here in London.
Beginning on Friday.
Beginning on Friday. Yeah. So we have a professor and an editor, and Xiaolu Guo, who's really impossible to pigeonhole, I think, really. A novelist, writer, commentator, and a great filmmaker as well, who was, as she wishes me to point out, 16 at the time of Tiananmen Square, but will explain what she was looking at and what she was thinking at that time. She's now based here in London and has been for some time, and has written a number of very well-received books. Village of Stone, a concise Chinese-English dictionary for lovers, 20 fragments of a ravenous youth, and the latest one that's been getting rave reviews most recently, I Am China, which you'll talk about tonight because it has a root in Tiananmen. So that's the panel. I'm going to ask each of them to speak for 4 or 5 minutes or so on what they see about Tiananmen, what they think is important, what they think we should be thinking about. Then hopefully spark off a little bit of a chat that will be between them, with them answering a few questions, and then plenty of time, as I'm sure there will be lots of Q&A, and we've got time for that as well. So there should be a very good discussion, I think. But I think, Louisa, your book is out, People's Republic of Amnesia. It's everywhere. I'm going to confess that I know that in the run-up to this book, when you had written it and got that out of your system, done the reporting work, done the writing work, sent it off to the publisher, and all of a sudden it suddenly became reality. Covers were appearing, blurbs need to be done, presses are about to roll. You had a little bit of a fit and suddenly panicked about what had you actually done. Well, can you explain a little bit about what is this book and why would it have made you so nervous as it approached publication?
Yeah, well, it's true. I had a massive panic because the whole process, in a way, it seemed so unreal. It was the way that I got to write this book was quite unusual. The publisher had actually come to me and had said, we're really interested in a book on Tiananmen 25 years on, its legacy, what does it mean? would you be interested in writing it? And my initial reaction was just to think, oh my God, no, of course not. That would be a crazy thing to do. It's such a politically sensitive topic. It's really difficult to write about, and there's so much debate inside exile communities as well, among those who were part of it. And there were all these sensitivities. But then the more that I thought about it, the more that I thought that it was actually time for a book to be written. There had been a lot of books that were written in the immediate aftermath, written by student leaders who'd fled into exile, who were really telling their own stories. But there hadn't really been anyone who'd taken a kind of long look over the years at what it meant inside China and to the people who had stayed behind. So I started to want to do it, and then I agreed to write the book. I flew to New York and I signed a contract, and I went back to China and I said to my editor, I'm not going to call you while I'm in China because I don't want this book, I don't want it to go public too early. So I decided that I would write the books quite secretly. Everybody that I spoke to knew what I was doing, but I took all these sort of precautions that were maybe unnecessary. But I never spoke about the book at home. I never spoke about it in the office. I never spoke about it on the telephone. I never spoke about it in emails, because I just was paranoid that perhaps, it would jeopardize the whole project and I wouldn't be able to finish my research. So I started doing research and I started writing it, and about 2 weeks after I got back, I realized that the book proposal that I'd written was completely unworkable. There was no way that I could write that book. So but I couldn't tell my editor because I told him, I'm not going to call you from China. So I just switched my plan completely, and I wrote a completely different book from the one he was expecting. And I didn't tell him for months and months until I left China, when I rang him up and I said, the good news is I've written quite a lot. The bad news is it's not really what you were expecting at all. It's a completely different book. But luckily, by that stage, it was too late, so he just had to go with it. But then I also wanted the book not to go public too early. So, by then, and maybe it was being in China so long, kind of secrecy was part of the process. I think in a way I'd internalized so much of the censorship that I felt that, maybe I shouldn't talk about it too much. And suddenly my publishing company was like, oh, you need to do publicity. We're going to send this book out to, 500 journalists. And that was the moment that I had my panic, where I was like, oh my God, I really have done this. But the book went out and it was all okay. And I think the reason that I was nervous, looking back, is that, this year was an extraordinary year. The crackdown in the run-up to the anniversary was extraordinarily intense. There were more than 150 people that were detained or arrested or placed under house arrest. It was much more intense, the crackdown, than usual. And, for the people that I spoke to, they had taken a real risk to speak to me. And, it was one thing when they were talking to me, but a year later, when you start to see, people around you being detained, it was really sort of nerve-wracking few months, because several people who I profiled in my book were detained. Some were arrested, some were sent on enforced holiday. And so that was a really very, very scary moment.
And since the book's been published, you still feel that responsibility? Has there been any word from the ether at all, or anything that you can see as a reaction to the book?
Well, the only reaction that I've seen is actually in the coverage in The Economist magazine, where there was a very nice book review.
By me.
Yes, thank you. And when that copy of The Economist was sent into China, they ripped out all the pages that referred to June the 4th, including the book review.
Wouldn't it be horrible to be the book that was on the back of that review? Just like the nice book about gardening or something that was on the back there, and you just lost all of your...
So that's been it so far.
Oh. James, you were, I mean, really, Tiananmen was the start of your reporting career, really. I think very, very close to the start of your reporting career in China. But this thing that we call Tiananmen, Tiananmen is really a shorthand for something that had been building up for a long time and something that's gone on for a long time afterwards and something that happened across the country, as we'll talk about. I mean, could you talk perhaps a little bit about, how you found yourself in the middle of all that, but also what was the milieu around China at that time that led to this thing? This thing didn't explode out of nowhere. Where did it sort of come from?
Well, I arrived in China in 1986, and that was really a year when China was coming alive politically. One could feel it as a journalist in almost any encounter with academics, with students. Political reform was a hot topic. Changes going on in the Soviet Union were being hotly debated. And this in the context of a country which in other domains was still very much unreformed. China, although it had been embarked on its program of reform and opening since the late 1970s, had not really changed in the urban context to any great degree. It still felt really much like North Korea today. Almost everybody worked for the state. Students had to accept jobs assigned by the government. One of the first stories that I reported on in 1986 was the opening of the first bar in Beijing. It closed down a few months later for want of business. I still remember the first private restaurant in Beijing. It's still going, actually, close to the art museum, Meishuguan. Private enterprise was still a dirty word in China, and yet against that background, politics was becoming hot, and by the end of 1986, we were seeing protests break out in a number of Chinese cities, and indeed, I was. I can sort of modestly say the first on the scene or the very first of them in Hefei, where the great late astrophysicist Fan Lizhi was then teaching. I got on a train when I heard about the protests and went out there and found the campus full of posters put up by the students calling for freedom, democracy. The slogans that became popular in Tiananmen were being aired then, give me liberty or give me death, the kind of phrases plucked out of their understandings of Western democratic development. That, of course, was cracked down on by early 1987, but very soon after that, again, in the build-up to the party congress in late 1987, it was back on the agenda. And one really sort of defining moment of that pre-Tiananmen build-up, I think, was the moment at the end of the party congress, the 13th party congress in 1987, when the new Communist Party leadership, in fact, the real leaders were old men who we rarely saw, but Zhao Ziyang, the newly appointed general secretary, came out, and we were in a small room, not much bigger than this, foreign journalists, and all of the new Politburo marched out in front of us, raised glasses with us, and freely and spontaneously answered the questions we put to them. So Zhao Ziyang talking about everything from who made his suits to the latest thinking on the then outdated campaign against bourgeois liberalization. It was an extraordinary and electrifying moment, and suggested that the Chinese leadership was beginning to change, beginning to recognize that personality was important in politics. And I think all of us sensed that China was on the brink of some major sort of seismic shift in politics, to the extent that, sort of fast forwarding now to '89, when rumours started going around the city that Hu Yaobang, the ousted General Secretary, was ill. I remember going to the airport, and Li Peng, the then Prime Minister, was about to head off on a foreign trip, and he confirmed that indeed Hu Yaobang was not feeling well. And we drove back into Beijing, a group of correspondents in a car with, when we were discussing the implications of this. And I can sort of say now, with sort of some modesty, that I said that if Hu Yaobang dies, China will blow, and sure enough, a few days later it did, and the rest is history, which we can discuss. But one thing I would say about, the very obvious sweep of history since 1989 is that one thing came to a halt in that month, and that was discussion of political reform, and it hasn't resumed. Tiananmen remains a major sore in the political system. As Louisa brilliantly describes in her book, it's something little known among a new generation of Chinese growing up, perhaps little thought about by many people who weren't actually directly involved in it, but it remains something that really gnaws at the heart of the political system there.
I'll come back to why so many people seem to not know about it now, but Xiaolu, you were 16, you're in southern China, you had family that were involved in things there. Try and get a sense of what people knew, how they knew things, what was flying around at that time, rumour, gossip, hard information, soft information. What was happening with you there at that point?
Maybe I wouldn't directly comment on the event, because 87, 88, 89 was really important for China, for the youth, like my generation youth, born in the early 70s. I remember very well, 1989, two very important novel book for me from the West published, and that's how I am nowadays. My literature influence, my poetry influence. One book is from Russia. It's an 800-page long novel called "The Life and the Fate" by Grossman, Vasily Grossman, and it was banned in Russian for years. And of course, 89, it was published in January. So I was wondering, after May, after June, would that book been published? So that was a very important book. Now I remember it's about big ideological discussion, the war between Russian and German, how the ideological war never worked, yet humanity took over after 800 pages of argument from that novel. And another book is Allen Ginsberg's Owl, and that was the first translation I had. And remember China published as a pocket version, like the original American version, and that was like Bible for me because I was a young poet. I published it 2 years before that. So it's like, the voice I tried to gain and acquire from the West, from the Beat generation. And I think it was so important for me that year. I remember I was kind of punk youth writing poetry. If there's a punk in China, there's supposed to be punk in China, but I don't really believe. But I thought I was a punk youth. And the first time I listened to the Doors, it was really powerful for me. And at that time, no one knows Sex Pistols, all this stuff, because still too bad for the ears, But the Doors is fine, Jim Morrison was also good. So that was a year I remember, because there's two books introduced to China, and then there's a June 4th thing, and my brother was on the square, I remember, and I was in the high school. I remember we were receiving phone calls, and he lost voice in the phone, saying, I'm fine, but we started the hunger strike. And I think I was very vague about the whole movement because I was still in my illusion of some kind of, Western fantasy of this kind of, youth and revolution, everything's pink. But I think you see, there's no pink thing in the revolution. Because my father was in a camp for 15 years, was in a Cultural Revolution camp. So my father was ex-prisoner, so he knows the consequence of any sort of revolution from the youth. And he was very worried, and my mother was even more worried, the woman follows man, as our tradition is. And so they were really very worried. And I remember this telephone conversation back and forth. And eventually they lost contact for 2 or 3 days. And then everything blurred because you're not supposed to talk about your son was on the square, so you have to lie. No, he was good. He was studying, in his room. So we never talk about that after the 5th of June. But anyway, so these are kind of become sorrowful memory if you're native Chinese, if you are that kind of generation believing love and the revolutionary. And now this type of generation is silly, considered to be silly in China because it's totally commercialized society. People don't believe that kind of thing. They believe the Western value and the American way of freedom, all that. So in the reality in China now, a certain elite or disillusioned elite talk about this event, or someone like me, disillusioned in the West, talk about this. But it become poetic, melancholy, I think, in the literature, in the cinema. It's a memory which slightly become a part of this kind of vague memory of a cultural revolution. You're not supposed to talk about it because you haven't come to terms with it, or the government, not allow you to talk about it. So that was things around that event, when I was 16. But I think, for me, that is not elite movement. It's grassroots movement. It started from Opium War. China, the last 150 years, was in search of democracy. And it's certainly Western type of democracy, because that word, democracy, Mingzhu, was a translated word in China in the 1919, when we had the May 4th movement, which is the first modern new cultural movement in China, after the end of the First World War, when Japan took over the German colony, which is North China. And that was the time tried to enter this idea of Western democracy, because if you don't change, the feudal society is gone, the emperor is gone in the early 1990s. So, but Opium War in the 19th century, the first international war with China was Britain. And that was the kind of shameful war, forced China to open, to look at the West. But yet, that time, China wasn't ready or didn't understand what is the whole thing about. So for me, it's kind of the last 120 years. This is a journey, the Chinese youth, or the elite, or even grassroots, peasant, kind of looking for a path for modern China, but it's never fulfilled. It's never found its voice. And I want to mention these 2 words in Chinese. In the 1919, in Beijing University, all the professors was promoting these 2 words called a Mr. Tsai and a Mr. D from the West. We need to get these 2 Mr. from China, to China from the West. Mr. Tsai meaning science, Mr. Science, because Chinese we can understand what is science, so we say Mr. Tsai, okay? And then Tsai Shenzhen. So another word is Mr. Dai, meaning Mr. Democracy. So in Chinese, it's De Xiansheng. So if we can get these 2 men from the West, Mr. Science, Mr. Democracy to China, China will be empowered. But so far, science might be, democracy is zero still, 100 years,
Talking about, May the 4th is an interesting one, because again, a lot of people see May 4th as just something that happened in Tiananmen at that time, right? And a lot of people still see 1989 as something that just happened in Tiananmen. Your book is revelatory, I think, to most people, in that particularly the sections where you talk about Chengdu and what you saw in Chengdu. And I think it's important, if we're going to understand what Tiananmen means to the whole of China, to understand, again, it's not just an elite thing in a square, that there are things happening all over the country. Why was that new to you as well? Why did you feel it was very important to look at that, as that Chengdu incident particularly?
Yeah, it was new to me as well. It was actually something that I almost kind of stumbled over in the course of my reporting, because I was trying to write the book secretly. I was still doing my day job as a reporter for NPR, and I was writing the book at night and in my spare time, and I happened to go to Chengdu on a reporting trip for something completely unrelated, and I just met this woman. I just by chance met this woman who lost her son on June the 6th, 1989. And she had spent the last 25 years trying to find out what had happened to him. She'd become a petitioner, someone who goes around the government offices trying to get justice, trying to get answers. And, you know, I was quite almost mystified because I didn't really know that anything had happened in Chengdu. And she was saying, no, you know, I lost him in the protests and he was detained and then he was beaten to death by police. And you know, it was really hard for me, partly because she also had an incredibly strong accent, and I had to get someone to help translate. But then she started to tell her story, and it was, you know, none of it was anything that was familiar to me, because in the West, we tend to think of Tiananmen as something that happened in Beijing, that happened in Tiananmen Square. And of course, that wasn't the whole story. It happened all over China. You know, in dozens of cities there were protests, even in small county towns. And that really has been forgotten, partly because the press was so preoccupied by Beijing and the elite power struggles, and was really busy. There just weren't enough reporters to go out there speaking Chinese and finding out what happened. But her story was interesting because she had been so persistent that after 11 years of petitioning, she'd been given... she'd been told her son was beaten to death in police custody. She'd been given a photograph by the police of his corpse, which showed how he'd been beaten. You know, it showed his blood around his nose and his mouth and bruising on his face. And it was very clear that he'd been beaten. And then in 2006, I think, she was given money by the government. It's the only payment that's ever been made in connection with an 89 death, although they called it a hardship allowance. But she was given almost $8,000, and the understanding was that she should stop causing trouble. She should take the money and shut up. But she still wanted to find out more, so she kept, you know, petitioning. And so I heard her story, and it just, you know, there were so many parts of it missing. I didn't understand what were these, you know, what was all this fighting that she was talking about? Because she was said, you know, my son was caught up in the fighting. So I started looking into it, and I started trying to find mainly Western eyewitnesses who were there, because I thought they would have more documentary evidence. They were more likely to have cameras. They were more likely to have kept diaries that they still had. And I started trying to put the pieces together. And by the end of it, you know, I was sent 1,000 boxes, 20 boxes of photographs of what happened in Chengdu, sort of secret reports written by Communist Party members who'd gone around the hospitals. And it was, you know, it was this extraordinary story that was never reported. They had had very big demonstrations. And then they had a hunger strike. And then what was different was that on June the 4th, after the crackdown in Beijing, people in Chengdu came back out onto the streets. And this time they were protesting against the police brutality and the army brutality, the killings in Beijing. And they were carrying mourning wreaths and these signs saying things like, "We're not afraid of death." And the army was not deployed. It was the People's Armed Police, but they used batons and they beat people very badly, targeting protesters' heads. And people died at that time, and the government admitted it. It admitted in its own literature that 8 people had been killed, including 2 students, and 1,800 people injured in that round of violence. But then this sparked off real sort of street battles with protesters in Chengdu trying to take revenge by burning down state property, like the state-run market and cinemas and police cars and buses. And then the next day there was this attempt by some people to attack a hotel, the Jinjiang Hotel, which still exists. You probably stayed there. It was once the swankiest hotel in town. And there was a US consulate inside the hotel. So there were a lot of foreigners who were sheltering inside the consulate. And there were diplomatic cables that described all the events. So there was all this evidence, which, you know, I actually just kind of stumbled across. And all these these eyewitnesses who told the same and really shocking story of what they had seen out of their windows, how they'd seen these rows of protesters kneeling on the ground with their hands wired behind their backs in a way that they would have had to, as security forces would have had to break their arms to wire them behind their backs. And then how the security forces went round and one by one beat these protesters and kicked their heads. And after a few hours, these two trucks came in and they just threw all these bodies onto these trucks and drove them off. And the people who were watching were convinced that they had witnessed an atrocity, and many of them went to Amnesty, they went to the press when they got back to their own countries and tried to tell, people what they'd seen, but nobody was really listening. And there was, quite a lot of evidence in the Chinese reporting of it as well. Even the numbers of people that had been detained at that hotel that day. The press report said 70 people were detained. The press reports even admitted that the government had used violence against some of the protesters. So it was just sort of astonishing to me that so much had been written over the years about Tiananmen, but sort of huge stories had not been told at all. So that was why I thought it was important to start looking at that, even if there are still a lot of gaps in the reporting. 25 years have passed, and there's still a lot that I can't say for sure what happened, but I think that just kind of retelling the story and for people like the woman whose son died, she spent 25 years trying to tell the story, and no one has ever really listened before.
Then, despite the sort of focus on Tiananmen, of course, among those correspondents who were based there, even that, that story, the story of what actually happened on the square itself, was very imperfectly told, let us say, at the time, and it took quite some time to unravel a clearer picture of what happened, to the extent that the notion of a massacre on Tiananmen Square is now largely discredited. But in a sort of very strict definitional sense, that is the area within that sort of perimeter road. There certainly was a massacre on the approach roads to it, but only a tiny number of foreign correspondents was on the square when the denouement occurred, and as a result, a lot of reports were depending on accounts given by student protesters and others who said they'd seen what had happened, and in the panic and tension and so on of that moment, those few hours, stories were distorted, and so the idea that sort of crept into some foreign media coverage of tanks rolling across tents full of students on the square, crushing them, mowing them down with machine guns on the square itself, I think was rather wrong.
It's not surprising the media or the West media being kind of blocked, and including the Chinese media. Of course, I think if you look at the Chinese history, been 2,500 years being autocracy. There's never kind of republic system in ancient China until now. And when emperor gone in the early 50 years ago, when Mao took over China, and it's kind of replacement another type of autocracy, which is not the Western constitution. So okay, we call that authority type of government, authoritarian government. But again, it's a type of autocracy which based on the party is the law, and it's not the other way around. The law controls the party, not in the Western way. So in the history, in the dynasties, a major revolt would cause a dynasty change. Therefore, the emperor's name changed from the peasant revolting or the eunuch revolting in the court. So the last two major revolts in China, one is Tiananmen event, another one is Falun Gong, the whole mess surrounding the Falun Gong movement. So one of these events could cause a dynasty change if we say it's post-Mao dynasty, which is now China. And of course, the government would control effectively, and that's very logical. So for me, the interesting point is why China it is now, like it is now, and still functioning with all the economic growth. Maybe the mystery is not how 1989 was, and how it became, and how people overcome with it. Get on with it, with the pain and the sorrow. I don't agree amnesia at all, because I think you can't talk about this as amnesia, because it's a fear and a pain you have to bury in order to move on, in order to survive in a practical way. You know, it's very Chinese or East Asian kind of philosophy. You talk about the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. You know, it's not memory loss. It's such a pain you cannot overcome. So you may as well just move on. So I'm interested in how the system, how the political system in China continued, and very effectively, and how the democracy would really be achieved in the next 20 years, and how the government would face that.
Louisa, how is that? You look at that in your book, right? No, how is it that something has sort of dropped off the map so completely, seemingly? I mean, you know, and there can be no discussion. There is no sense of a Truth and Reconciliation Committee. There's no sense that this can come out and be worked out at all. It's just keep on moving and don't talk about it. Amnesia, as you said.
Yeah, I mean, you said that you didn't agree with the use of the word amnesia, and I think for perhaps the generation that lived through it, it's buried, but it's still there. But when you look at the younger generation, I think there is no sort of institutional memory. There is amnesia, because young people in their 20s, to a very large degree, really have no idea what happened in 1989. And I mean, I did this experiment where I took the picture of Tank Man, which is in the corridor just out there, taken by Jeff Widener, and I went round 4 of the Beijing universities that had been really instrumental in the protests, and I asked people how many people, you know, if they knew what this picture was, and could they tell me? And only 15 out of 100 people knew the picture, and it was quite clear who was lying and who wasn't. Just the power of that image was really apparent, because the students who really didn't know what it was, they would lean in to look at it, and they would ask me questions. And 19 students said to me, "Is it a military parade?" You know, more than actually the students who knew what it was. And I mean, I think it's not just in universities as well. You know, we've seen in the press, there have been a number of things that have crept into newspapers. There was one picture of students with gunshot wounds that appeared in the Beijing news. And there are a couple of things that just creep into newspapers from time to time, simply because people don't know to censor them, you know. And when you think of the number of eyes that a Chinese newspaper will go through, you know, that a photograph of students wounded in 1989 should be printed in the Beijing news, and that the photo editor, the page editor, the editor of that day, the censor, no one knew that this was related to 1989. No one recognized it to censor it. I think it shows that the institutional memory has gone.
Well, I think, you know, I would think, you know, if they don't know, it's really largely because of transparency doesn't exist. The media, the open media doesn't exist in China. So in a way, but you know, if you ask a peasant in a little village, you know, he really, you know, the lifestyle is so traditional that the modern media hasn't arrived to the village. And it's not he's been indifferent to the political problem. It's this profound machine of not giving you, it's a propaganda machine, not giving you what you need to know, but give you what you should know. I think that's a machine doing the thing with the memory, you know. Because it's quite strong, the propaganda machine. It can rewrite your memory. So.
But I would argue that people are also cooperating with that, because I think, you know, the generation that was there, that was on the square, the people that were taking part, often they don't tell their children what happened. And even those people who were injured on the square, you know, or were student, you know, protest leaders, often they just simply don't talk about it because they fear if their kids knew what happened that it could be dangerous for them. You know, they might develop anti-government sentiments, or, So I think that people have felt they have no choice but to sort of collude and cooperate with this silence. And that has helped the amnesia to kind of take root. And I mean, although, yes, we have the internet and there are people who can get around it, I was surprised at the lack of curiosity of young people, because, these were kids who could totally find whatever they wanted on the internet. But I feel like young Chinese really, to a large degree, have internalized the firewall, the censorship. They kind of know which topics they should steer clear of.
I mean, this is my last question, really. Yeah, what do you say to those people who you'll hear this argument all the time, and you must have heard it a lot, which say, there's no point. There's no point in talking about this, right? It does no one any good, right? It doesn't help any of us get what we want, whether it be a better life as a peasant, or a property, or a car, or holiday, or whatever. It does none of us any good. Why do you foreigners and some dissidents keep going on about it, right? It was 25 years ago. 25 years in China feels like, 90 years in England. Why do you still keep going on about it? Why are you writing this book? Why are you having meetings about it? Why do you keep asking me questions about it every time there's I do a press conference or something? Is that, you must have come across that argument a lot. What do you say to that?
Well, I mean, I think that the truth of the matter is it doesn't just matter to dissidents and foreigners. The history matters an awful lot to the Chinese government. Otherwise, they wouldn't be going to these great efforts to stop people from talking about June the 4th. If it was not important to the government, they wouldn't be putting, arresting, detaining 150 people in the run-up, putting people in jail, muzzling old ladies who want to find out what happened to their children. In a way, the Chinese government's own actions are making the events of 1989 more and more relevant, because they are so nervous about their own past. I'm curious what you think, James. You were at the Square at the time.
No, I absolutely agree. And I'm just wondering, if we didn't have the internet, and particularly just in the last, say, 3 or 4 years, the rapid, explosive growth of social media in China, would we be seeing at least a somewhat more confident Communist Party when it comes to dealing with this? I think one factor possibly in their response to the 25th anniversary, which was, as you describe, more intense in terms of the scale of the roundup of dissidents, controls on media, on threats to foreign journalists. Indeed, this really hadn't happened before on an anniversary, warning them not to publish stories on Tiananmen. With direct warnings from police communicated to foreign journalists in Beijing. Why was there this extraordinary degree of nervousness about the anniversary? I think social media is a big part of it. It's been a game changer in China, and I think it helps to explain what we've seen in terms of Xi Jinping's behavior since he became General Secretary in 2012, with a clampdown on dissent and liberal discussion, if you like, that has been more persistent, I think, than we've seen during similar transitions since Tiananmen. We've seen great persistence also in his campaign against corruption, and unusual persistence, but also similarly unusual persistence in his handling of dissent. And I think a great part of that is the growth of social media, and particularly this year, obviously, a concern about that synergy between the social media and discussion of Tiananmen, the risk that Tiananmen will begin to filter out through these media into the public consciousness and begin to address this problem of amnesia.
Okay, we'll do some questions. Okay. So raise your hand. I think there's a microphone. Is there a microphone? This gentleman was waving at me from like ages ago, so we've got to give him the microphone over here first, I think.
I'm going to be a contrarian and ask you why Tiananmen is so well known, actually. My family were part of KMT in Shanghai from 1921. I was later asked to adapt Man's Fate. I guess you all know the story about how that was again and again quashed by the Central Committee. Later on, I tried to get Human Rights Watch at the time you were in Tibet. Fu Ying, we had many, many meetings here about this. I've always been perplexed. To me, the Chinese Revolution and the coming of the Chinese people into the world is the greatest story in history. There are far worse things than Tiananmen, the Great Leap, obviously, many, many horrible things through the two civil wars, the two united fronts. What is it so much about Tiananmen that bugs the Standing Committee? Why is Ma Zhan barred not to go back to see his dying mother? Why is Lao Yiwu spent all those years in prison for writing a requiem for Tiananmen? Bi Feiyu, who I've had my picture of, he's a good guy. He's not like he's not like a social realist in the Soviet period. He's not actually that different than the other writers. Why is Tiananmen as a symbol, and this is a communist country, political symbolism is very, very important. Why is this thing, which is actually small compared to so many other horrors that took place, why is it always this focus on this one thing? I don't get it. I've never understood it.
Louisa, what's that?
Well, I mean, I think there's a lot of reasons, but one of the biggest is because the media was there. The world was watching, and it was really the first event that was, broadcast in real time. If there had been pictures of the Great Famine coming out, and at the time, then maybe that would have been a huge thing, but it didn't happen with the Cultural Revolution or anything else in Chinese history. But this event was covered so assiduously, and because there was so many media there for Gorbachev's visit, having all the big American anchors there meant that it was prime time TV around the world. So I think the fact that people were watching and the world was watching, and it couldn't be covered up, I think that is one reason why it is sort of so important, but also because its legacy has been so important to the development of China today. I mean, there really isn't an aspect of China's modern-day China that hasn't been affected by decisions made after the crackdown, because of the crackdown. And I think those are, some of the reasons why it is such an important thing, both in Chinese history, but also.
I mean, for me, it's really not about China. Sorry, I think it's all about East Bloc, the whole East Bloc. If you look at the Soviet history, it's such an alarm moment for China. And I've looked at Czechoslovakia at that time, and I've looked at Poland at that time. And the same, 89, we know what's going on, the Velvet Revolution, the Berlin Wall fell down. It's not about China at all, and it's not about Tiananmen. So the whole Soviet history, only 70 years. It collapsed in 1931. And I remember that time because it's 3 years after the event. Now, I'm talking now, the Chinese Communist Party survived 65 years until this year. So do we have 5 more years to go? And then the collapse of the anarchy and the freedom. So this is really sensitive, that moment. I remember, I was in the province, but I heard my brother was saying, on 1921, in Beijing, in the street, you see the blonde Russian prostitute in Beijing street because the whole collapse. All the states of the ex-Soviet Union come to China to sell the fur coat, also sell their body as blonde young women. That's a big phenomenon for a socialist country to accept such a phenomenon as our big brother, as George Orwell said, selling their own soul to their small brother. Okay, so that was a moment you felt this nervous air, at that time. And also the censorship starts to be very tightened up. Because after Cultural Revolution, end of 70s, the censorship opened up. That's what I said. All this Western B generation, even Charles Bukowski was translated in the 80s to China. And you can't imagine that in 60s and 70s China. So that was the mouth of opening up. But once you open up, you will become Soviet. You will fail. We will become all this Western country, which is in Eastern Bloc, collapse. And I think since 1991, Soviet become Putin's Russian. You see all the problem in that northern country, our big brother. And I think Chinese Communist Party is so smart in a way, it's really swift and clever to deal with preceding this coming turmoil of the history when the system being replaced. And in a way, people were saying, that 89, perhaps it's lucky China didn't succeed, the youth didn't succeed at taking over Tiananmen Square on 89. Of course, that's not an excuse to delay the democracy process of China. It's not an excuse. But the law wasn't established in that time. And still, it's not the law rule the country now in China. It's the Chinese government rule the law. So it's not law-based country. And I think it wouldn't succeed. Even 89 taking over Tiananmen, it will be kind of a mess, resemble to ex-Soviet. Now, for me, it's not about China. So it's about Eastern Bloc.
James, you have managed to break bread with some senior leaders. Why is it such a bugbear?
I wish I had. No, and apart from that great event in 1987,
Never again.
No, I mean that was an interesting change after Tiananmen, a concerted effort to restrict casual contact between foreign correspondents and the very top levels of the leadership. There was very limited contact before 1989, but there was a sign of change, and one. Great event that we used to enjoy before 1989 was an annual National Day cocktail reception when all the foreign correspondents and senior diplomats would be invited to the Great Hall of the People to mingle with members of the Central Committee, and we could go.
That would be unbelievable.
Just unimaginable, even now, 25 years later. And the reason for that is Tiananmen. But I would say in response to your question, I think the answer is actually fairly easy for most of the period since Tiananmen. And the answer would simply be that the leaders responsible for it remained in power. Deng Xiaoping didn't die until 1997. Jiang Zemin, of course, came to power because of Tiananmen. Jiang Zemin stepped down in 2002. His successor, Hu Jintao, wasn't directly involved in Tiananmen, but of course Jiang Zemin was still alive. Hu Jintao himself owed his power to Deng Xiaoping, so there was obviously a great belief in maintaining the status quo and not approaching that question. So I think the more intriguing question is why, over the last couple of years, have we seen not only no movement at all on this, but in fact, if anything, a sort of greater attempt to silence debate about this issue. Xi Jinping, after all, was a party chief of Ningde, a prefecture in Fujian province in 1989. He wasn't involved at all. Li Keqiang, the prime minister now, was, I think, a vice chairman of the All China Youth Federation in 1989. Unheard of in those days. Certainly not involved in all of this. So these are men who could move things along. Their careers are not tainted by Tiananmen. But I think the reason why we're not seeing movement is that, one reason, and there's one very obvious one, and that is once you start addressing the whole question of Tiananmen, the question of the role of powerful institutions, the military, and the sort of fundamental questions about the rule of law, and begin bubbling up, and the party, particularly since experiences elsewhere in the communist bloc and colour revolutions, is deeply fearful of all those questions being raised. But more specifically, I think old man politics is not yet over in China. Jiang Zemin is still around. I think he's 87, 88 or something. These people do not want to address the question because it means tackling very important old men in Chinese politics. And although we see signs now of some degree of willingness to do this, the attack on Zhou Yongkang, I think, perhaps is a sign of some willingness to take on the big players. Tiananmen, I think, remains a huge taboo.
Another question? Gentleman here, I don't want to go to.
Thank Thank you. Millions of Chinese people leave China every year on holiday or for business trips or to even come and live either in the West or in other Asian countries where censorship is not what it is in China. And yet, when they do return to China, they don't appear to be hell-bent on agitating for change and reform. Do you think it's the case that those people are, I guess, have sort of drunk the Kool-Aid of economic development and don't care because of that? Or do you think it's the Western cultures of consumerism and the cult of celebrity that seems to be more important to the youth in particular than the culture of democracy?
Might as well just go around. Louisa, yeah?
I think if you're a young...
You've just spoken, by the way, at a lot of American universities,
Yes.
where presumably there are a lot of Chinese students.
Yes.
And did any of them come? Did any of them comment?
They did come. In certain cases, all of the Chinese scholars were mandated to come and attend my talk, and the fellows, the Chinese fellows, and there was a few back rows of very annoyed-looking Chinese fellows, yawning very obviously, as much as possible. I think if you're a young Chinese person who gets to go overseas, a lot of your concerns are going to be primarily economic. Probably your family have taken out big loans to get you to go overseas. You know, you'll be thinking about getting a job, getting married, buying an apartment, finding a wife, and you need an apartment to find a wife. So, you know, those are going to be the things that really kind of preoccupy you. And I think in a lot of cases, the students that do go overseas as well, I mean, they've also, don't forget, had a lot of patriotic education. That was a big campaign that was brought in 1991, post-Tiananmen, because Deng Xiaoping believed the big mistake was that people didn't know enough about China's past. They didn't really understand how bad things had been. So I think you do get, you get some students who go overseas, and when they hear other versions of their history, they find it hard to believe, because there's, they sometimes, some people even will believe it's a conspiracy theory, a Western conspiracy theory, and of course, their economic concerns are uppermost in their minds. I mean, I think there are people also, in my talks, I've had a lot of young Chinese people who've come and who have also been really interested and who've come up to me afterwards and said, well, what am I supposed to do with this knowledge? What do I do with it now? And I mean, so I think you do get a range of responses.
What do you do with it? That's my, what do you do once you know it? What do you tell them to do? What happens then once you know something like that?
Well, once you know knowledge, you can tell other people. I mean, once you're talking about it, there's less silence. You're breaking the taboo. I think it is important. Just, reading the book, buying the book.
Yeah, we're buying the book, obviously. Shall you? You're the opposite of those kind of. I mean, you're absolutely not the Chinese girl that came to study accountancy at Harvard. You but then you went off the rails fairly quick. Didn't you? And, but do you think that that's largely because you missed, which I think is very important, you missed that post-Tiananmen education system, the mother country love and patriotic education system, which
it wasn't
maybe affected that?
It wasn't new. Since 1949, it was ongoing everyday education. If you're in China still now, if you look at the textbook in Chinese primary school, middle school, maybe there's slight change with, fun textbook replaced very propaganda textbook, but the ideas, the ideology is the same one. It's just different color, more vivid color. It's there. I would say this way. Since 1949, China has been internationally isolated like Cuba. It's been prosecuted. It's a notorious case, especially for American-centered power. Yeah? So that China and the government and a certain kind of, the old generation communist party, like my father's generation, is a reactionary attitude against the West, so-called imperialism. Yeah? China was imperialism, but it wasn't in the recent 200 years history. Yeah? So it's a reaction towards the West prosecution to China and Cuba and certain other countries. Now, only Cuba and China remain in the whole platform. Yeah? And of course, we don't talk about North Korea because that's another case. So I'm living here in London, but I'm still clearly a post-Marxist. But I might not live in China forever. But still, my certain value in me, I still believe and I value them immensely. Even I live in London. Yeah. So the young people, the indifference towards politics of young people from China, actually quite smart, because they know under the current political system, which will be another 2 generations of leadership. I'm not talking about 2 generations of normal citizens. Because leadership in China takes 20 years for 1 generation to change the education system, the whole thing, yeah. So it's really, say another 40 years to change 2 leaders. Then if you're 18 now, you will be 40 by then. So under the current system, you may as well go with the material pursuing your dream, which is the American dream. And in that way, you might sustain your life or the quality of life. By arriving that moment, China might become something different. Now, I don't mean democracy not going to come. It will come quite urgently, maybe within 10 or even several years, because China needs democracy not for political reason, but for ecological and environmental reason. It's a disaster what's going on in China. Not politically, not economically, but ecologically, that is the biggest topic now in China. China is poisoning itself by inventing all this the massive pollution inside China and around the world. It's everywhere. So the cancer rate, the deaths, the leading cause of death in China for the last 30 years is cancer. And it's mainly from food and water cancer. Most women died of lung cancer, has never smoked in their life, air pollution. So this will require the democracy. So it's not within ideology struggle. It's something from the really organic force of life. And that actually is for me, is a hope. Democracy will come actually much more quicker than we thought, because we only talk about ideology struggle. And we're super politicized a society, which is, I think, is an illness. Anyway, so I can't help to mention my novel, I Am China. It's not for publicity, but it's the point about these 2 lovers separated, because the man keep on believing ideological struggle is the only solution for China. And the woman, the lover, doesn't believe that's the final solution. She believes that's just trivial struggle towards a final solution. So that's, in a way, my belief. I'm that woman, but I'm that man too at the same time. But I used to be that man. Anyway, that's what I say. Yeah.
James, this media conspiracy thing, which you do hear a lot from people as a sort of shorthand, that it's all just a media conspiracy, that the foreign media reports China in certain ways, and you've written for a publication that actually, is taken notice of in China to more extent than others. I mean, it kind of seems to go up and down a little bit as to how evil the foreign media is.
In the
how
minds
much
of
it's
Chinese. In the minds of Chinese.
Yeah.
Yes, I think there is now greater skepticism, certainly, than we felt in the late 1980s. That's for sure. Then the foreign media were regarded widely by students, liberal intellectuals, and others as almost a kind of conduit for their concerns. At that time, I was reporting for the BBC, and one had the extraordinary experience of sending a dispatch back to London, then going off to a university campus and hearing that having been translated into Chinese by the BBC's Chinese service, and then broadcast on loudspeakers, back to hundreds of Chinese students. Of course, the internet hadn't been heard of in those days, so this was their only source of information, and all holding up their tape recorders to kind of catch the latest word that I had written in my sort of rather second-hand way about what they were doing. There was that great turning point, I think, in 2008 during the rioting in Lhasa, when members of the Foreign Press Corps experienced a backlash from the public of a kind that we'd never felt before. Inspired by a sense that foreign journalists had deliberately distorted that story. that in so doing they had sort of profoundly upset the Chinese public, which regards Tibet, the whole question of Tibet, in a rather different way.
As the only journalist who was in Tibet, did you then get death threats?
No, not at all.
Because we had death threats in our office
yes,
at the time.
no,
so I was, yeah.
no, death threats indeed. Some journalists even sort of leaving the country for a while. Quite extraordinary, and odd, in fact, given that the foreign media had actually reported pretty accurately on this right from the start. But it was a sign, I think, of a sort of change in public mood in China that we've seen over the last few years. The upsurge of patriotic pride, nationalism in the build-up to the Olympic Games at the end of 2008, and of course perpetuated since then by the global financial crisis, the sense in China of a West in decline, China on the rise, the relative power of China and the West changing dramatically, and this feeding into a sort of strange dichotomy, really. On the one hand, a greater sense of China's power and prowess globally, but on the other hand, still internally, enormous insecurity, a sense of fragility, as made clear this year in their response to the 25th anniversary, a lack of trust in their own public. That nationalism hasn't translated into greater internal confidence, but it does, I think, from time to time, change the way that the Chinese public sees us. And of course, they have so many other sources of information that they're not totally reliant these days on the BBC.
Okay, let's have a question from this side, due to gentleman at the back. Some nonsensical idea of fairness and democracy that I'm applying.
Okay, mine isn't so much a question as a statement. I was a student from Leeds University in Beijing in 88, 89. I attended many of the demonstrations in Tiananmen. I was present when various Chinese friends of mine were looking for friends of their own who'd been shot at by the PLA. So I've lived with the repercussions of Tiananmen for the last 25 years. I've continued to work in China, and I had an interesting experience earlier this year when I was in a hotel bar having a drink late in the evening, and I was talking to the barmaid, as you do, and she asked the obvious question, when did you first come to China? I said 1988, and she said, well, I was 4 years old at the time. And it was interesting because she started asking me about that year, and she knew that something had happened, and she knew that something significant had happened, and she started asking me about it. And I think the most important thing was that she was from Anhui province, not particularly well educated, nice enough, but she really didn't understand what had gone on. But so she was asking me, but there was a confidence and there was a realization that something had actually happened. And I think what was important that struck me at the time was that previously I'd assumed that generation had no idea. But I think it's actually important to understand that they do understand that something happened and there is a realization. And I think no matter how much control the Chinese government feels it has over the media and the control of information, that it does actually seep through.
When you were writing your book, once you got talking to people, did the inquisitiveness tend to come out more? Once you broke the subject and started talking about it, did floodgates open, or did people remain guarded?
In many cases, people were nervous. They didn't. If there was something that they didn't know, they didn't want to know what it was. Right. But I mean, I think that there were more avenues of finding out information. And what was interesting to me was last year I was in Hong Kong at the time of the anniversary, and I was really struck by the number of Chinese, mainland Chinese, who were going to Hong Kong specifically to find out more. They had set up a temporary, it was called the Temporary Massacre Museum, and it was on a university campus. And I spent, quite a lot of time just hanging out there, chatting to people passing through. And there were a lot of mainlanders. There was even a 40-strong tour group from Anhui who'd all gone en masse to visit the museum. And the same at the vigil as well. There were, a fair number, mostly not young 20-somethings, mostly older people who had been part of it or had been sympathetic and, wanted to almost reinforce their memories by seeing the other side. So, I think there are ways that people are finding out, and I think the government is nervous about that. Even the people in Hong Kong kept hearing stories of people not being allowed to leave China at that time, to avoid, seeing the vigil and the censorship over the annual vigil in Hong Kong and all the protests that are going on in Hong Kong is also very intense as well because of the fear of this contagion effect.
Let's, on my nonsensical democracy, let's take a question from along the front somewhere. That would be you then.
It's Masato Kimura, Japanese journalist. My question is about the life expectancy of Communist Party is 70 years. Who believes that and who are worried about that? And how serious are they worried about that? And so secondly, these days, the West foreign direct investment into China dramatically dropped. It depends on their paranoia of Communist Party or just economy rebalance policy from export-led economy to demand-led economy.
I'm not very good with English. Can someone translate this question to me? What's the first question? Sorry.
You mentioned life expectancy of Communist
the life
Party.
expectancy of the Communist Party is
70 years because Soviet Union collapsed after 70 years established. And so Chinese TV reported that they do research on why the Soviet Union collapsed, and they decided to slow down open policy, and they close the information. And so Xi Jinping break their open policy. It is reported. And
I'm sure the later part is for James, but I'm just going to answer the early part. I don't see that's the life expectancy of the Communist Party in Soviet. It's totally accidental contingency. The historical moment finished on the 1991 for the Soviet system, and it's not that is the time. It's just for me it's accidental clash of all the events happened in the Eastern Bloc. Okay, but it didn't affect China greatly. China continued until now, and the economical industry that let's say that industry replaced the movement of democracy in a system, the change of system, which I think perhaps the most smart way to change. If you look at the poverty level in China and poverty level now, but again the new problem will replace the ideological crisis, which I said is an ecological problem. But Xi Jinping part, those men thing, I really don't know. James, can you answer that?
But James, I think what the gentleman's getting at is that thing that you hear a lot, but of course it's never written down anywhere, that somehow there was this supposed pact between the party and the people, that if the people don't question the party, particularly about Tiananmen and things, as long as the party keeps delivering growth, then everyone can just keep quiet and have some sort of benefit from that. I mean, we give that any credence, and that time is running out, and dropping foreign investment into China would be a sign of that.
Right. No, I mean, there's no doubt that the rate of growth will slow over the coming decade. I don't see any sort of inevitability or or in terms of acting as a trigger or catalyst for dramatic political change. Even if the economy were to tank, in other words, drop to very low single-digit growth, 2 or 3%. One has to bear in mind that it's kind of been there before. The period right after Tiananmen was a period of very low single-digit growth for a couple of years. Yes, much has changed since then. A middle class has developed in the last 10 years. The internet has opened up a discussion, a national dialogue, if you like, through media such as Weibo. So there are reasons to worry from their perspective that that Chinese society is becoming more difficult to contain. But moving from a situation where you have a large number of people with various different grievances to a situation of all-out upheaval on a scale that we saw in 1989 is still, I think, in the current situation, very difficult to imagine. And of course, one big lesson they learned from Tiananmen was how to respond to unrest, respond more quickly, crush unrest as soon as it appears. From their perspective, the problem in 1989 was allowing students to get out on the streets in the first place. So we see far more effective control of unrest at its very initial stages of development. The big question, I think, and really, what could change this, as was indeed the chief catalyst in 1989, was not some sort of mass upheaval, but rather a struggle at the top, which then gave a signal to people below that that things were changing, that the leadership's eye was off the ball, and hence people felt empowered to come out onto the streets. At the moment, we still see a relatively unified leadership. There are huge questions over the nature of the struggle now going on to deal with Zhou Yongkang, who today is now, they've now officially announced, is under investigation. He's the most senior party figure to be put under investigation for corruption, and it's quite likely that part of the dynamics of this is Xi Jinping trying to assert his authority over the influence of leaders who preceded him. But we don't have a sense of a country as politically brittle as it certainly felt in the build-up to 1989, and we saw a number of indications in the build-up to April 1989, when the demonstrations first broke out, that there were huge rifts in the leadership, policy differences over the economy, differences over political reform. I think now still there is a relative unanimity within the leadership over the question of political reform and indeed over economic direction. So for that reason, I think I would remain doubtful that China's on the brink of a Soviet Union.
Last question, gentleman in green at the back.
Yeah, hi. Actually, my question is slightly related to what James just said, but I look at, I mean, as an investor in China for the last 10 years, I look at things slightly differently, wherein every time the rate of growth slows down in China, you see the leadership spring into action immediately, whether it was 2009 after the financial crisis, or as recently as this year in the last couple of quarters, where growth only went down to 7.5% or slightly lower. And you already start seeing the government getting nervous and putting in more and more stimulus, levering up the economy, taking more debt, and I'm just curious that why do you think that a lower growth rate of 3% in a country that is so indebted and has so many non-performing assets would not actually cause a serious social unrest, specifically in the lower strata of economic thing?
James, can I just ask, this is the final comment from everyone, and James, you can address that question. Just 25 years on from Tiananmen as well, any prospect for change? Where will it come from? How will it happen? Or won't it happen? And again, addressing that, if you'd like to address that gentleman's question, and then get a final comment.
Well, the key question is the impact that would have on employment. We saw in the immediate wake of the global financial crisis, of course, a huge shock to China's export sector. Millions of migrant workers laid off who melted away back into the countryside, returned a few months later as exports began to pick up again, and with almost no sign of the kind of social dislocation that many people thought had been quite likely at that time. And of course, a big reason for that was the nature of land ownership in the countryside, which means that many of these migrants still have a claim to land back in their villages, can still at least survive if they don't have jobs in the cities. And that's one reason why the whole knotty question of hukou reform, household registration reform, has been so difficult to advance, simply because of their fears of greater social unrest in the case of economic shock, such as occurred in late 2008. Already we see the economy slowing down to 7.5% or so growth predicted this year. Or almost no sign. I mean, well off the double-digit rates of most of the past decade, and almost no sign of urban employment problems yet arising from that. There is a great problem of graduate unemployment, a huge growth in the number of students graduating from Chinese universities and failing to find work, and there's long been a concern about that and the possibility that this would feed into a new wave of unrest, and it hasn't. I think still broadly speaking among the Chinese urban middle class there is or at least has been a sense that things will keep on improving. I think there's a risk over the next few years that that sense will diminish, but I think it would take a pretty prolonged downturn, probably, to produce serious unrest relating to unemployment.
For me, I think if we talk about those big words, big thing, the future of China, it's really about how the Chinese government dealing with the disappearance of the peasant population in current Chinese society. As very similar to Indian society, we used to have 70% of population of peasants, which is nearly 1 billion. And at the moment, still 500 million population of peasants living in the countryside, and the poverty level is very high, perhaps less than in India. So this is a big question, how the government transform this nearly 500 million peasants population into workers on the middle class society. That's a huge target. So in a way, I don't think any government can deal with that easily, because China is not following Western model, not American model at the moment, and not ex-Soviet model at all, and not European model. And in a way, it's interesting and exciting for a writer like me, because that the system itself creates its own model, whether grotesque or interesting or hopeful. It's self-inventing its system, So it's great in a way. from evolution point of view, you know, from the long history from the past till now, this is a great living museum in terms of ideological system, political system. Yeah. So in that sense, it's very exciting if you really look in depth of that country.
Louisa, last word.
I think when you ask, should we expect change, as Westerners, you tend to imply political change towards some kind of democratic system. And I think there are political changes, but not the kind going on, but not the kind of political changes that that we imply. There is political reform, but it is a kind of tightening of the control of the party, of the control of Xi over decision-making in the party. And I mean, we have seen a party which has been very adaptive. They've managed to sort of take on people's concerns and deliver enough, but they're reaching a time where there is unrest. I mean, 180,000 protests in 2010, which was the last year for which there were figures, and then a new ethnic insurgency in Xinjiang, problems in Tibet. And so far, the lesson of Tiananmen really has been for them to really almost perfect the security apparatus on which they now spend more money than their international, on their military. So I think it is, the big problem is going to be that the demand from below is for more political participation and for, also for change when it comes to the environmental crisis, the ecological crisis that you talk about. I mean, the biggest protests probably that we've seen have been the anti-PX against polluting power plants in cities. And those are the things I think that the party is really terrified of. And I think the big problem will be how to sort of fill that divide between the government's increasing control and the demands from below, and whether the party can be adaptive enough to do that.
Bang on time. There's a bookshop down here, a range of Xiaolu's books, including I Am China, a new one, which is most relevant to this evening. And Louisa's People's Republic of Amnesia is here. They'll be here and they're signing. The Economist is published every Friday morning and it's at every newsagent and dentist's waiting room in the country. And there's some free Economist reports.
Yeah, a report that I wrote. I think.
The James wrote, so he'll sign that. Xiaolu Guo, James Miles, Louisa Lim, thank you very much for coming.